Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Mark My Brain. Today's topic is something that I've come across during one of my previous episodes, and that is learned helplessness, which is a situation where we are unable to find any resolution to a difficult situation, problem, even when that solution is accessible. And I've come across this term or this phenomenon in psychology during preparing my episode 23 about moving on and death of hope. I've found it very, very interesting and fascinating, and since then I've been coming across new insights into that, as you usually do when you learn something new. You then see it everywhere around you. And so today I wanted to focus on this phenomenon specifically, because it's sort of a psychological trap that I believe many people fall into without even realizing it, myself included. I did fall into it, and I will share my personal stories and experience with it. And it's still possible that I still do sort of fall into that pattern still in some areas of my life. But of course, the more I know, the better prepared I am to deal with it. So, learned helplessness. It's a situation you get yourself into, or not a situation. It's a sort of a mental state you get into where you get so used to not finding any solution to your problem, to your issues, that you sort of stop trying and you don't resolve the issue even when that the solution becomes available. I'm sure you have sometimes felt stuck in a situation where nothing you did seemed to matter, and where you've tried so many times to change something that you've simply sort of given up trying because nothing worked. That's sort of the gist of all of it. But it's much deeper than it might seem from the first get-go. So let's begin with a bit of history. The discovery of this learned helplessness phenomenon. It was in 1967 when psychologist Martin Seligman made this accidental discovery into human behavior. And he was then conducting experiments on dogs. He was initially studying classical conditioning, something we know about from Pavlov, right? And when he came across this sort of thing, the experiment he was conducting was that he exposed the dogs to electric shocks that they couldn't control. And these dogs that been exposed to electric shocks without any control over them, later failed to escape when escape was actually possible. So the dogs had essentially learned to be helpless. Even when presented with a simple solution, jumping over a low barrier that could get them to safety away from that electric shocks, because they've learned that there is nothing they can do to stop it, they just laid down and accepted the pain. And here's a sort of a striking part. Dogs that hadn't experienced the uncontrollable shocks quickly learned to escape. The difference wasn't in their ability, right? It was in their belief about their ability to control the situation. That's key. Their belief about their ability to control the situation. And I will throw a little modern twist into this, because recent neuroscience research has actually flipped the Seligman's original theory on its head, sort of. We now know that helplessness isn't actually learned. It's our brain's sort of default response to prolonged stress. And what we actually learn is control, the other side of the coin, right? This makes the phenomenon even more significant, because it means we have to actively work to maintain our sense of agency in difficult situations. So that's sort of the background behind it. Now let's look at some real life examples. Now we might have a sort of theoretical image of what it is, but how can it manifest in real life, right? Because it's not confined to only psychological labs. It's everywhere in our daily lives, often hiding in plain sight, I would say. So, for example, in the workplace, imagine a talented employee who repeatedly suggests process improvements only to have her ideas dismissed or ignored. And after months of this, she just stops contributing in meetings altogether because she's developed this workplace learned helplessness, the belief that her efforts won't make a difference, even though new leadership, for example, might be completely open to her suggestions. She just won't even try because she's learned that it doesn't lead anywhere. The same way in academics, consider a student who struggles with math, for example. Despite studying hard, they consistently perform poorly on tests, and eventually they stop trying altogether, convinced they are just not a math person. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their belief in their inability actually prevents them from improving, even when they have the cognitive capability. And I actually have a friend who was exactly like this in high school. Although he definitely had the capacity for it, he kept sort of undermining his own self-esteem and confidence in this subject. It was math, that it usually led to fulfilling his negative expectations about performance on tests, right? And the effect of learned helplessness goes far beyond just giving up. Research shows that it creates a cascade of problems that can sort of fundamentally alter how we experience life. There are some cognitive, physical, as well as emotional effects of it. So cognitively, people with learned helplessness develop what psychologists call a pessimistic explanatory style. They start explaining negative events as permanent. So this sort of, oh, this will never change, pervasive. This affects everything in my life. This one thing, it just ruined my whole life. And personal. It's all my fault. And these sort of thinking patterns. And this just reinforces the helplessness, which unfortunately creates a vicious cycle. And physically, learned helplessness is also linked to compromised immune function, increased susceptibility to illness, and chronic fatigue. The stress of feeling powerless literally changes our body's ability to cope with, challenges. And of course, emotionally, it's strongly connected to depression and anxiety. In fact, learned helplessness shares 8 of the 9 symptoms used to diagnose major depression. The only symptom it doesn't typically produce in laboratory settings is suicidal ideation. And it's only because researchers usually use mild stressors for ethical reasons, of course. And what's particularly troubling is how learned helplessness can sort of spread, in organizations. It can become a cultural phenomenon when entire teams, or perhaps even generations, adopt this mindset of that's just how things are, even when the change is entirely possible, right? And here I would like to add my own story, where I can see the role of learned helplessness as prominent. For those of you who listen regularly, you might remember that I sometimes mention that since last summer, I've been dealing with states of severe anxiety and panic attacks, coming seemingly from nowhere. And the root of this issue is a discussion for another time, but what's instructive here, I think, is the progression. Because at first, I had no idea what's happening, no clue what to do and how to deal with all of this. And this led to me feeling powerless in regards to this issue. And when seemingly everything I tried failed to make me feel better or mitigated the problems, I sort of surrendered trying And subconsciously, I was just trying to survive and waiting for things to get better, to sort of be saved, or how to say it. And looking in retrospect, it seems pretty obvious. But of course, while this lasted, nothing changed. Almost the opposite. This sort of stagnation and resignation only made me, in many ways, feel even worse. And it was only when I left the country for an exchange studies program in Italy, where I was sort of forced by external circumstances to function on my own, pick up initiative again, start making decisions, etc. Basically doing things despite the way I feel and the tendency to resign, that I started feeling better. Again, the root of the original problems, I think, are somewhere else, but the vicious cycle, locked in place with the help of learned helplessness, only made things worse and could have perhaps been avoided if I've, had the insight there and then. And because of many of the symptoms of my anxiety and panic attacks were psychosomatic, I was naturally curious if learned helplessness is also linked to some psychosomatic issues. And well, there is a lot. Learned helplessness creates chronic stress that fundamentally alters immune system functioning. It leads to compromised immune responses, increased susceptibility to illness, and weakened natural defenses. And research shows that feelings of helplessness especially influence the body's surveillance system, that normally protects against abnormal cells and diseases. There's also a lot of gastrointestinal problems. The connection between learned helplessness and functional gastrointestinal disorders is sort of well established from what I've read. And these conditions, including irritable bowel syndrome, often involve hypervigilance to body sensations and these sort of catastrophic thinking patterns that mirror learned helplessness. And, when I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, oh my god, this is exactly what I've been dealing with a lot during the last summer, and of course sometimes since, as well as some other issues, for example, other somatic symptoms, including feeling tired, having low energy, along with symptoms of hopelessness and dizziness that are also tied to learned helplessness. That also resonated with me. People with learned helplessness are often more susceptible also to more frequent headaches, even migraines. So it's all of it is a pretty nasty brew of everything. And of course, as we already mentioned, it works in sort of this vicious cycle mechanism, because this relationship between learned helplessness and the psychosomatic symptoms often creates these self-perpetuating cycles, as it was in my case, I think, to some degree. You start demoralizing and having the physical symptoms, the demoralization from what's happening to you often amplifies the pain perception, the sort of nervous overload, where chronic stress exceeds the body's ability to cope. You start catastrophizing, because learned helplessness also promotes pain catastrophizing, the tendency to magnify threat perception and maintaining this excessive focus on pain or not well-being. And of course, then you might start avoiding or having some avoidance behaviors. As with chronic fatigue syndrome, for example, learned helplessness can lead to avoidance of activities due to fear of symptom exacerbation, increasing the symptoms or the likelihood of the symptoms appearing, which of course leads to or results in a physical deconditioning that actually worsens some symptoms, right? And this was, again, like 100% the case in my situation the last summer, because I've became so afraid that anything will trigger the panic attack or the anxiety, where I just felt so fucking shitty that I sort of stopped or started avoiding some activities that I normally liked to do, Hobbies I liked to do, I just stopped doing them because of the fear, which led to my condition worsening, and again, we are in the cycle. Also, some interesting insights from sort of neurobiological point of view points to some compelling evidence that there is a biological basis for this mind-body connection, that it actually, or studies actually show that learned helplessness is associated with altered gray matter volume in brain regions involved in pain processing, emotional regulation, and stress response. And it can also trigger increased production of pro-inflammatory markers, I would say, that can directly cause physical symptoms throughout the body, right? So what we've learned so far is what learned helplessness is. It's this sort of state of mind where you go to, or your body naturally goes to, when exposed to prolonged stress that it can't find an escape from. It can manifest in many different areas of life, in workspace, in academics, in relationships. It has many effects on our body, from cognitive, physical, emotional symptoms. We've went also over some of its ties to psychosomatic symptoms or issues like gastrointestinal problems, the irritable bowel syndrome, chronic stress, tiredness, low energy, hopelessness and dizziness. And we've also touched on how it can sort of stay in this vicious cycle that's sort of self-perpetuating, right? So now let's continue diving deep, and we are coming to the part where we will sort of start dealing with it. Now we've mapped what's out there, we've mapped the issue, we know what it is we are dealing with. Let's continue and see what we can do with it. Modern brain images have revealed the sort of fascinating neuroscience behind learned hopelessness, and that it's when we experience uncontrollable stress, it activates the serotonin neurons in the dorsal raphe nucleus. I don't know how to pronounce it properly, I'm sorry. But it's essentially our brain's give up switch, And this creates the passive, defeated behavior we associate with learned helplessness. Okay? So the tie is uncontrollable stress activates our give up switch in our brain, and that leads to the defeated resignation, resigned behavior. But there is an empowering part to it. When we learn we can control a situation, our medial prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, kicks in and actually inhibits that give up response. Even more remarkably, once we learn control in one situation, our brain becomes better at recognizing control in future situations and building resilience. Now that's a key insight, okay? It shows us that still there are things in our control, and even though we perhaps might not be 100% in control of all situations, it's important to sort of keep this belief in our ability to control some aspects in ourselves. And this means that learned helplessness isn't a character flaw or permanent condition, it's a changeable brain state. Okay? And once we learn we have control in one situation, it sort of becomes easier to recognize that in other situations. It's an avalanche effect, right? So how do you know if you or someone you care about might be experiencing learned helplessness? Of course, it's always difficult to say, from amateur's point of view, but there are some signs I've put together that can sort of point you into that direction. You can look for patterns of avoidance, giving up quickly when faced with challenges, and passive acceptance of negative situations even when alternatives exist. And especially the avoidance is something to keep an watch on. You can also watch for phrases like, nothing ever works for me, I can't do anything right, or what's the point of trying? And these sort of catastrophic tendencies that, if they are consistent, they can sort of also reinforce the learned helplessness that might be even like beginning to form in someone. And of course, emotionally learned helplessness can often appear as chronic frustration, feelings of being overwhelmed by simple tasks, or the general sense of being stuck. And when it comes to physical symptoms, they can include unexplainable fatigue, headaches, or the feeling like you're coming down with something without actually getting sick. I think you know what I mean. But the good news is, as we highlighted, that learned helplessness can be overcome, and it's nothing permanent, it can be definitely changed. And the key to rebuilding is your sense of agency, or rather, the key to overcoming learned helplessness is rebuilding your sense of agency. Because as we already pointed out, the path through or over this issue with the help of medial prefrontal cortex is through learning you are in control in some situations. So a good way to rebuilding this sense of agency is to do it gradually, right? Choose one small area of your life where you can make a meaningful change. Maybe it's organizing your workspace or taking a 10-minute daily walk, and sort of exercise that. The goal is to prove to your brain that your actions do matter and they can change your circumstances, at least to some degree. For example, for me, again, if I can use example from the last summer, it was very important. If it's a super small thing, but it really helped. I sometimes started getting very anxious when I got on train, and my ride was always like 1 hour long. And this feeling of being stuck there and the feeling that I must remain there, that sort of built up anxiety in me. So I learned that a great way to sort of fight against it was to change seats from time to time. I sat down, I started doing something on the train, I started feeling anxious and I'm stuck here. I must remain in my seat, and these sort of thoughts started occurring. And what really helped was, just getting up and deciding I'm gonna go sit in a different seat. Hopefully you can see the pattern there, right? It's a very, very small decision, but it is in your control where you will sit. And you can sort of find anything, I'm sure of it, in your own life. As it is organizing your workspace, changing seats, having a different drink, choosing a different breakfast, taking a 10-minute daily walk, whatever it might be. If you start slowly, you can sort of begin rebuilding this sense of agency, which is, I think, very, very important to, even overall well-being, not just as a prevention of learned helplessness. Other things that also help with fighting against learned helplessness is, challenging your explanatory style. For example, when something goes wrong, consciously ask yourself, is this really permanent? Does it really affect everything in my life? Is it really the end of everything? Is it really all my fault? And sort of challenge yourself on these tendencies and beliefs. Because often you will find that your initial assumptions are too broad or too harsh and just don't reflect reality. And then again, seek control where you can. You might not be able to control your boss's bad mood, but you can control how you respond to it. Sounds awfully a lot like we are coming back to Stoicism once again. Well. And but it's true, right? Focus on your sphere of influence rather than what's outside of your control, because some things inherently are outside of your control and there's nothing you can do about it. But you are never completely 100% powerless. You always have some things you have power over. you know? And this way you can sort of start building the self-efficacy, sort of the belief in your ability to influence outcomes. You can also practice problem solving instead of, accepting problems as insurmountable. Break them into smaller, manageable pieces and, try one. Rather ask, what's one thing I could try rather than why is this happening to me? Again, try to rewire your brain to look for solutions rather than dwelling on problems. Because again, dwelling on problems, it only reinforces the sort of helplessness, the powerless feeling, right? You can also build support networks, which is a broad way of saying don't get isolated, because isolation definitely feeds learned helplessness, as well as many other mental issues and problems. And connecting with others who, for example, even overcome similar challenges can provide both practical strategies as well as just the typical sort of social emotional support. And of course, as always, you can choose to seek or consider professional help. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no shame in it. It's just, one way, one tool you can use to help fight this nonsense, this mental trap, right? So these are some of the ways I would go about fighting it. As I mentioned, the key is rebuilding your sense of agency. And you can do it, with small steps, starting to make small decisions in your everyday life. You choose how you think and explain things to yourself, how you think about things. You seek control where you can, distinguish what's really in your control and what isn't. You can practice problem solving in different areas of your life. You can sort of build on social support and, even consider professional help. Those are all ways you can fight this if you find yourself in the cycle of learned helplessness, for example. And now I would like to add some more fascinating research findings that I came across that didn't really fit into any of the previous chapters, sort of. So, for example, studies show that even animals as simple as bees and zebrafish can develop learned helplessness, suggesting that it's fundamental biological response to uncontrollable stress, which isn't uniquely human. It's sort of a basic survival mechanism that's gone amiss, sort of. And in educational settings, learned helplessness can be accidentally created sometimes by well-meaning teachers who sort of over-scaffold assignments, for example. When we constantly help someone to the point where they don't get to experience solving problems themselves, we can sort of inadvertently teach them that they are incapable. So if there are any teachers listening, you can sort of watch out for that. And another sort of counterintuitive finding I've come across, people with sort of advanced directives, or rather directives prepared in advance, or clear end-of-life plans, are less likely to develop learned helplessness in medical crisis. Having a plan, it seems, even for worst-case scenarios, apparently helps maintain a sense of control. Which makes sense, right? So just make a plan for certain situations, make a plan for tomorrow, make some to-do list, for example, make some goals you want to achieve, which you will pursue. And I can tell you, even again from my own experience, that definitely if I have sort of my plans, routines even, that are based on some to-do lists or based on some goals, I definitely feel like overall my life is more in my own control than when it's sort of chaotic, just happening, I'm going with the flow, which of course can be very fun sometimes, but if it's a sense of control you're looking for, I think making a plan, to-do list, sticking to a routine, pursuing goal again, those are all great things you can do to increase that feeling. And maybe something a bit hopeful again. There has been some research done on congenially learned helplessness rats, sort of basically animals bred specifically for their tendency towards helplessness. And it's shown that even genetic predispositions can be overcome with the right interventions, which is so fucking cool, right? This suggests that no one is permanently doomed to helplessness. Fuck yeah, that's fucking awesome, man. And sort of starting to tie this whole topic together, I also want to mention some best defenses and maybe preventions against basically learned helplessness. And again, it sort of ties to how to fight directly or how to break free directly from learned helplessness. But when it comes to prevention, you can again practice sort of controlled challenges, regularly engage in activities that are challenging but achievable. This not only is a key to sort of getting into a flow state, but again, to sort of start building this self-efficacy thing. And the key here is to experience success after some effort. Then you can also sort of think through if you have control in multiple domains of your life. It's again sort of not putting all your, I don't know, self-worth eggs in one basket, so to say. Basically just not relying on one pillar of your identity as a whole, but having diverse areas where you feel competent, sort of, whether it's work, relationships, hobbies, community involvement, whatever it is, sort of diversify, not only in your investments, but also in your own life. You can also start changing how you think about things, developing a growth mindset, which is a sentence that's become sort of a meme recently, but it's true here. You can start sort of teaching yourself to view failures as learning opportunities rather than the evidence of permanent inadequacy. It's not just about the positive thinking. It's, again, this approach sort of reflects, again, changing the explanatory style about our circumstances and how we view our circumstances. Then again, staying connected, building that social support around you, very important. And of course, regular self-assessment. Again, you can do it by yourself, or if you are seeing someone, I don't know, therapist or psychotherapist, you can do it with them. If you feel, for example, if you have the tendencies to fall into patterns like this, you can sort of schedule with them that, I would maybe like to check up from time to time on this particular issue, right? But you can even ask yourself, where in my life do I feel most in control? Where do I feel least in control? What's one small thing I could change in this difficult area? And so on and so on. So, slowly coming to an end, let's sort of summarize this whole topic. I think that learned helplessness is one of psychology's most important discoveries because it reveals something very profound about human nature. And that's that we are not passive victims of our circumstances, but we can become victims of our beliefs about our circumstances. You can sort of really heavily feel this dependence on our own beliefs and how important it is to have them in order, to have this self-belief and believe in your own abilities and competency. Otherwise, as you can see, it can slowly undermine your whole life experience, I would say. The revolutionary insight from modern neuroscience is that helplessness isn't learned, but control is learned. And this means that every time you take action, solve a problem, persist through a challenge, you are literally rewiring your brain to be more resilient. So keep that in mind. And if you recognize learned helplessness in your own life, remember that awareness is already the first step towards change. You are not broken, weak, or permanently stuck. You're dealing with a very human, and not only human, right? We've seen animals do the same. You're dealing with a very human or nature's natural response to stress that can be overcome with the right approach. So try to keep this hopeful, positive tendency or thought in mind. So the next time you catch yourself thinking, nothing I do matters, remember that thought itself is not a fact, it's a symptom, and symptoms can be treated. Your actions do matter, your choices do make a difference, and you have more control than you think. And with that, I would like to say goodbye to you. Thanks for listening to today's episode about Learn the Helplessness. If this resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might benefit or find it interesting as well. And as always, take care and hear you next time. Bye.